Join me as I explore Hollow Hall and try to uncover if this place is really haunted by a chilling ghost mystery. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth as Caleb Morrow trudged along the gravel path leading to Hollow Hall Academy. It was late October, and the New England sky hung low, a bruise of gray and violet that seemed to press down on the world below. The school, a sprawling Gothic structure of weathered stone and ivy, loomed at the path's end like a relic from a forgotten era. Its spires stabbed at the clouds, and its arched windows glinted faintly as if reluctant to reflect the dying light. Caleb, a lanky 17-year-old with a mop of chestnut hair and eyes that always seemed to search for something just out of reach, adjusted the straps of his backpack. He was a junior at Hollow Hall, a boarding school tucked away in the hills of Vermont, known as much for its academic rigor as for its isolation. The nearest town, Ashwick, was a 20-minute drive through winding roads, and the school's campus felt like its own world, cut off from the bustle of modern life. For Caleb, this was both a blessing and a curse. He loved the quiet, the way the library's silence seemed to cradle his thoughts, but lately, that quiet had begun to feel oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tonight, he was staying late to finish a history project on the American Revolution, a sprawling essay that had consumed his evenings for weeks. The library, housed in the west wing of Hollow Hall, was his sanctuary. Its high ceilings, lined with oak beams, and rows of leather-bound books, gave it an air of timelessness, a place where the outside world couldn't intrude. But tonight, as he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, a shiver ran down his spine. The library was emptier than usual, the usual hum of students replaced by a stillness that felt almost tangible. "Mr. Hargrove?" Caleb called softly, expecting to see the librarian at his desk. But the desk was deserted, a lone lamp casting a weak glow over scattered papers. He frowned, glancing at his watch. It was just past 7. Hargrove never left before 9. Shrugging off the unease, Caleb settled at a table near the back, where the stacks formed a labyrinth of bookshelves. He spread out his notes, the pages filled with his neat, looping handwriting, and began to work. The minutes slipped by, marked only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, and Caleb found himself glancing up every so often, as if expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. By 9 o'clock, he was deep in his essay, scribbling about the Battle of Bunker Hill, when a sound broke his focus. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps on the hardwood floor. He froze, pen hovering over the page. The library was supposed to be locked after 8, accessible only to students with special permission, like himself. He listened, straining to hear over the wind. The tapping stopped, then started again, closer now, coming from the direction of the stacks. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding small in the vast room. No answer. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and peered into the darkened aisles. The shadows seemed to shift, though he told himself it was just the flicker of the overhead lights. "Hargrove, is that you?" The tapping ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it made his ears ring. Caleb's heart thudded in his chest, a primal instinct urging him to leave, but he forced himself to sit back down. He was imagining things, he told himself. The stress of the project, the late hour. It was playing tricks on his mind. He focused on his essay, determined to finish the section he was working on before heading back to his dorm. But the unease lingered, a weight that settled in his bones. When he finally packed up at 10:30, the library felt different, as if it had grown colder, the air sharper against his skin. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and made his way to the exit, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The corridor outside was long and narrow, its walls lined with portraits of past headmasters, their eyes seeming to follow him as he walked. The exit lay at the far end, a heavy oak door with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. He was halfway down the corridor when he saw it, a figure standing at the far end just beyond the exit. It was tall and thin, cloaked in shadow, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Caleb stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, but he felt its presence, a weight that pressed against his chest. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The figure vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness. Caleb blinked, wondering if he had imagined it. He hurried to the exit, his hand shaking as he gripped the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the courtyard beyond, shrouded in mist. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face, and glanced back at the corridor. It was empty, but the portraits seemed to stare at him with renewed intensity, their painted eyes glinting in the moonlight. The walk to his dorm was usually a short one, a 5-minute stroll across the quad, but tonight it felt endless. The campus was eerily quiet, the usual chatter of students replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Caleb kept his head down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, trying to shake the image of the figure from his mind. But as he crossed the quad, he saw it again, a shadow moving along the edge of the library, too tall, too thin to be human. He froze, his pulse racing. The shadow paused, then turned toward him, and for a moment he thought he saw eyes, pale, glowing orbs that seemed to burn through the darkness. Then it was gone, melting into the mist. Caleb ran, his sneakers pounding against the grass, not stopping until he reached his dorm. He fumbled with his key, his hands trembling, and locked the door behind him, leaning against it as he caught his breath. Safe in his room, he tried to rationalize what he'd seen. A trick of the light, maybe, or exhaustion, playing havoc with his senses, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Something was wrong at Hollow Hall, something tied to the figure he'd seen, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with him. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of rain pattering against his window. His roommate Ethan was already up, lacing his sneakers for a morning run. Ethan was the opposite of Caleb, broad-shouldered, confident, with a grin that could charm anyone. "You look like hell," he said, glancing at Caleb. "Late night?" "Something like that," Caleb muttered, rubbing his eyes. He considered telling Ethan about the figure, but decided against it. Ethan would laugh, call him paranoid, and Caleb wasn't sure he could handle that right now. At breakfast, the dining hall buzzed with the usual chatter, but Caleb barely listened. He picked at his eggs, his mind replaying the events of the previous night. He needed answers, and the best place to start was the library, not for books, but for information. Hollow Hall had a reputation for being old, steeped in history, and history often hid secrets. After classes, he returned to the library, this time in daylight. The room felt different now, warm and inviting, filled with the soft murmur of students. Mr. Hargrove was at his desk, sorting through a stack of books. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with a shock of white hair and glasses that perpetually slid down his nose. "Back so soon, Caleb?" he asked, peering over his lenses. "I had a question," Caleb said, keeping his tone casual, "about the school's history. Anything unusual ever happen here?" Hargrove's smile faded slightly, and he set down the book he was holding. "Unusual how?" Caleb hesitated, then leaned closer. "Like ghost stories or accidents. Anything tied to the West Wing?" The librarian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Caleb thought he saw a flicker of unease, but Hargrove shook his head. "Old buildings like this always have stories. Kids love to make things up. Haunted halls, tragic tales, nothing worth repeating." Caleb pressed him, but Hargrove deflected, claiming he had work to do. Frustrated, Caleb turned to the archives instead. a dusty corner of the library where old records were kept. He spent hours poring over yearbooks, and newspaper clippings, and school logs, searching for anything that might explain what he'd seen. Most of it was mundane, sports victories, academic awards, but then he found something odd. A clipping from 1973, faded and brittle, mentioned a teacher named Margaret Voss who had disappeared after a late-night staff meeting in the West Wing. The article was vague, saying only that the police had no leads and the school had mourned her loss. There was a photo of Voss, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and dark hair pulled into a bun. Her eyes stared out from the page, and Caleb felt a chill, though he couldn't say why. He dug deeper, finding a student newsletter from the same year that hinted at rumors surrounding Voss's disappearance. Some claimed she'd been unwell, others that she'd been involved in something scandalous. One cryptic line stood out. "They say she still walks the halls, searching for what she lost." Caleb's stomach twisted. He tucked the clipping into his notebook and left the library, his mind racing. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of Voss's face burned into his thoughts. When he finally drifted off, he dreamed of a woman in a long coat, standing at the edge of the quad, her eyes glowing like twin moons. Over the next week, Caleb became obsessed. He stayed late in the library every night, telling himself it was for his project. But really, he was watching, waiting. The tapping returned, faint at first, then louder, always coming from the stacks. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement, a shadow flitting between shelves, a figure just out of sight. He started sketching what he saw, filling his notebook with hurried drawings of a tall, thin silhouette. His friends noticed the change. Ethan teased him about looking like a zombie, while Leela, a sharp-witted girl from his history class, asked if he was okay. Caleb brushed them off, afraid to admit what he was chasing. But Lila was persistent, and one evening, as they studied together in the library, she caught him staring into the stacks. "What's going on with you?" she asked, closing her textbook. Her dark eyes searched his face, and he felt a pang of guilt for shutting her out. He sighed, then told her everything. The figure, the tapping, the clipping about Voss. To his surprise, Lila didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice low. "My grandma used to tell me stories about this place. She was a janitor here in the 70s. Said there was a teacher who went missing, and after that, weird things started happening. Lights flickering, doors slamming. She swore she saw someone in the West Wing once, just standing there, staring." Caleb's heart raced. "Did she say who it was?" Layla shook her head. "She didn't know, but she said it felt wrong. Like whoever it was didn't belong here anymore." They agreed to investigate together, starting with the West Wing after hours. The next night, armed with flashlights and Caleb's notebook, they slipped into the library just before closing. Hargrove was gone, the desk empty, and the room was silent, except for the hum of the lights. They moved to the stacks, where Caleb had heard the tapping, and began searching for anything out of place. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, the shelves looming like sentinels. Leela shone her flashlight on a row of dusty books, then froze. "Caleb?" she whispered, pointing to the floor. There, in the dust, were footprints, small, bare, and fresh, leading into the shadows. Caleb's mouth went dry. They followed the prints, their flashlights cutting through the darkness until they reached a locked door at the back of the library. It was old, its wood warped, with a brass plaque that read, "Storage." "We need to get in there," Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila nodded, pulling a hairpin from her pocket. "I've seen this in movies," she said, half joking, as she knelt to pick the lock. After a tense minute, the door clicked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. They hesitated, then started down, the steps creaking under their weight. The air grew musty, thick with the smell of mildew. At the bottom was a small room, its walls lined with crates and old furniture. In the center stood a desk, covered in papers and photographs, as if someone had been working there and never left. Caleb approached the desk, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The papers were lesson plans, dated 1973, signed by Margaret Voss. The photographs showed a woman matching Voss's description, but in some, she wasn't alone. There was a boy, maybe 10 years old, with her in several shots, his face serious, almost haunted. "Who's that?" Lila asked, peering over his shoulder. "I don't know," Caleb said, but his gut told him it was important. He pocketed one of the photos, then noticed something else. A journal, its leather cover cracked with age. He opened it, scanning the pages. Voss's handwriting filled every line, growing more frantic as the entries progressed. She wrote about a student, a boy named Daniel, who'd been struggling, isolated, bullied. She tried to help him, but something had gone wrong. The final entry, dated the night she disappeared, read, "He's gone, and it's my fault. I can't leave until I find him." Before Caleb could process this, a sound echoed from above, the tapping, louder now, accompanied by a low, keening wail. Lila grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. "We need to go." They ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind them, but the wailing followed, growing closer. As they reached the library's main floor, Caleb saw her, Voss, or what was left of her. She stood at the far end of the room, her form flickering like a bad signal, her eyes glowing with a pale, unnatural light. Her coat was tattered, her hair wild, and her face was a mask of anguish. "Where is he?" she rasped, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. Caleb stumbled back, clutching the journal. "We don't know," he shouted, his voice cracking. Voss moved toward them, her steps uneven, as if her body were breaking apart. Layla pulled Caleb toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge, as if sealed by an invisible force. The wailing grew deafening, and Caleb's vision blurred, his mind flooded with images. Voss weeping, a boy's lifeless body, a classroom stained with blood. Then, in a moment of clarity, he held up the journal. "Daniel!" he shouted. "You're looking for Daniel, aren't you?" Voss stopped, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment she seemed almost human, her face softening. "Daniel," she whispered, and the room grew still. Caleb's mind raced. He didn't know the full story, but he sensed Voss was trapped, bound to the school by guilt or grief. "We'll find him," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "We'll help you." The figure flickered, then vanished, and the door clicked open. Caleb and Lila stumbled into the corridor, gasping for air. They didn't stop running until they reached the quad, where the rain had slowed to a drizzle, washing away the night's terror. The next day, Caleb and Lila went to the headmaster, Dr. Ellison, with the journal and photo. Ellison, a stern man with a reputation for dismissing student concerns, listened reluctantly. When Caleb mentioned Voss and Daniel, his face paled. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, snatching the journal. "We found it," Caleb said, holding his ground. "What happened to them?" Ellison hesitated, then sighed. "It's an old tragedy, one the school prefers to forget. Margaret Voss was a teacher here in '73. She took a special interest in a student, Daniel Carter, a troubled boy. He died under unclear circumstances. Some said it was an accident. Others, well, there were rumors Voss was too involved and that she blamed herself. She vanished shortly after. The police assumed she left town, but no one knows for sure." "And Daniel?" Lila asked. Ellison's jaw tightened. "His death was ruled a suicide, but there was never a proper investigation. The school wanted it buried." Caleb felt a surge of anger. So you let her haunt this place? You let her suffer? Ellison's eyes flashed. There's no such thing as ghosts, Mr. Morrow. You've been reading too many stories. But Caleb knew better. Over the next week, he and Lila dug deeper, using the journal as a guide. They found records of Daniel Carter, a quiet boy who'd been relentlessly bullied, his only ally Voss. The official report said he'd fallen from a window in the West Wing, but the journal suggested otherwise. Voss had caught 2 older students attacking him, and in the chaos, Daniel had been pushed. Caleb couldn't let it go. He and Lila organized a memorial for Daniel, held in the quad on a crisp November evening. Students and faculty gathered, some skeptical, others moved by the story. They lit candles, read Daniel's name aloud, and shared stories of kindness, hoping to honor his memory and ease Voss's pain. That night, Caleb returned to the library alone, the journal in his hand. He stood in the stacks, where the tapping had first begun, and spoke into the darkness. Margaret, we know what happened. Daniel's at peace now. You don't have to stay. The air grew cold, and for a moment he saw her, Voss, her face calm, her eyes no longer glowing. She nodded, a faint smile breaking through her sorrow, then faded into the shadows. Caleb never saw her again. The tapping stopped, the library warmed, and Hollow Hall felt lighter, as if a weight had lifted. He and Lila grew closer, bonded by their shared secret, and Caleb's sketches of the figure became a private reminder of what they'd faced. Years later, as an adult, Caleb returned to Hollow Hall as a guest speaker, sharing his story, not of ghosts, but of truth, of uncovering what others tried to hide. The West Wing was still there, its windows glinting in the sun, and as he walked past, he felt a breeze, soft and warm, like a whisper of thanks. As the candles flickered in Hollow Hall's quad, Caleb felt the weight of the past lift, Daniel's name finally spoken, Margaret's sorrow laid to rest. But some mysteries linger, whispering in the shadows of old schools like this one. What secrets have you uncovered? Share your creepiest true crime or ghost story in the comments below. We're dying to hear them. If this chilling tale gripped you, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe with the bell to join our thrill-seeking crew for more haunting stories every week.